is the summer solstice? Well, Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees, and as it revolves around the sun, direct rays of sunlight hit different parts of Earth during different times of the year. During the summer solstice, direct rays of sunlight are over the Tropic of Cancer. It signals the start of summer in the northern hemisphere.
I'm a natural-born citizen. Fuck the middleman, boost of adrenaline, stand firm in my Timberlands, stomping on their forefathers, wicked warmongers who raped our grandmothers, fucking land robbers. We got leases that tie up the pieces, fought off the leeches, blood-sucking preachers, pushing poison from the pulpit to the government. I'm on some other shit, crossbow with the rubber grip, eagle feather on my hip. My mama is the mothership.
Kings County, Long Island, Luna Park, Coney Island, and the rest of the surrounding area of New York, with a specific focus on those locations. For the most part, the history of New York State, and specifically of New York City and Brooklyn, is shrouded in lots of mystery before the arrival of the Dutch, before the arrival of the European settlers. However, in this narrative, as we're told in much of the Northeast in general, the Lenape indigenous people were the last to reside in New York City directly before the arrival of these European settlers. Now, the Lenape themselves constructed massive fortifications all around the area of New York City. The Lenape also built these different passageways, these things that would become roads, like the King's Road in Brooklyn. In Kings County, or in what would become Brooklyn, we have the Lenape also constructing these massive earthworks, these mounds, and places of worship, places to live, and places that were beyond the definition of the Europeans at that time. They did not exactly fully understand the lifestyle of the indigenous people of the Lenape, but they did try their best to amalgamate the Lenape creations into their early city of Brooklyn and into the larger New York area. Now, the Lenape and their earthworks were then converted, some would say covered over, when the area was transformed. By the 1800s, we have people like Francis Law Olmsted, who would create parks like Prospect Park in Brooklyn. However, formerly, this Prospect Park was said to be earthenworks, an area that was lived upon, that was a retreat for the Lenape people. So we have to wonder how many parts of New York City, including the King's Road, all of the roads really that interconnected Brooklyn with the rest of New York, as well as the earthworks, the mounds, the very foundation of Brooklyn. How much of that could have really been created by the Lenape? However, once the Dutch arrived, they basically claimed all of this, and they used their power and their new relations to basically supersede any sort of indigenous pacts and to take over the area with ease while amalgamating the Lenape people into their own culture. Now, according to this official timeline of Brooklyn, which for the remainder of this video, we're going to be going through this timeline just to see if there's anything that stands out to us. But according to this official narrative, Brooklyn itself is the most populous of all of New York City's boroughs, and Brooklyn was established or settled the whole way back in 1646. This is when the village of Brooklyn or Breckenlin on the western end of the Long Island was authorized by the colonizing Dutch West India Company for the North American colony known as New Netherland. This was named after the town of Brooklyn in the province of Utrecht in the Netherlands. This was considered to be a reference to the, quote, old country. Now, in 1652, just 6 years later, we have the Wyckoff House that was built. The Wyckoff House, in part, still stands today and is part of the National Historic Landmarks of America. It's interesting because this is one of the first structures said to be built by Europeans in all of New York. By 1654, Brooklyn is given municipal privileges and it's also enlarged. More communities are added to the city limits of Brooklyn. By 1658, the old Gravesend Cemetery is open. This is now a cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places, and this is said to be the cemetery where all of the earliest settlers from the Dutch area were buried. The Dutch governor in 1664 surrenders the colony to the Royal Navy's English fleet under the authority of James, the Duke of York. And this is when New Netherland becomes the province of New York. So again, just to dive into this history a little bit, many who talk about New York consider the ancient history of the Dutch European settlers in the area. And they talk about how New York City is built on all of these Dutch foundations, but realistically, the Dutch, according to the timeline, only occupied this area for, let's see, roughly 20 years or less. So essentially, all of the creations, whether you want to believe it was the entire city or building out the streets or just laying down the foundation that would become New York, that would become Brooklyn, we're led to believe, and many scholars seem to indicate, that the Dutch should be given credit for all this. And they always say, yes, the Dutch had help from the indigenous people. But realistically, in 20 years or less, when the Lenape and the earlier Native Americans were here for hundreds, if not thousands of years, can you really consider that all of these creations were made by the Dutch? Or rather, the Dutch were given credit by the Europeans who arrived later, because in the 1600s, in the 1700s, almost always the credit was taken away from the indigenous people. Again, we have Europeans giving other Europeans credit, and then they claim that they took it from those Europeans and made it their own. But realistically, we can see that all of this history in the earliest timeline seems to indicate that the majority of New York and Brooklyn were already created by the Lenape. By the year 1700, the new Utrecht Reformed Church is built in Brooklyn, indicating that there's still a very strong Dutch presence in the area at this time. By 1766, the Wyckoff-Bennett homestead is believed to have been built, and during the American Revolution, the Wyckoff-Bennett homestead housed the Hessian soldiers who were hired by the British Army. This site was also declared a National Historic Landmark in 1976. In 1776, so right when the United States would declare independence, we have Mayor Dave Matthews, who was arrested in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn on orders from George Washington, related to Matthews' suspected involvement in the Hickey plot to assassinate Washington. On August the 27th that same year, 1776, we have the Battle of Long Island, which occurred, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, or the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. This was the largest battle in the American Revolutionary War. The British Army wins this battle and begins the New York and New Jersey campaign. The British set up a system of prison ships anchored all along Brooklyn's Wallabout Bay, where more American Patriot soldiers and civilians died than on all of the battlefields of the war combined. In 1780, Fort Brooklyn is constructed in the Brooklyn Heights area along the east bank of the East River by this British Army. They then occupy New York all the way into Manhattan, and they also construct Fort Sterling, which is later razed for British housing developments. In 1783, we have the famous Evacuation Day. British forces leave New York and Manhattan under the terms of the Treaty of Paris. After occupying the area for over 7 years, General George Washington and his officers of the Continental Army take control of Brooklyn. In 1786, Erasmus Hall High School, the oldest public high school in Brooklyn, is founded as the Erasmus Hall Academy, a private school. Later, the private school is joined by a free academy to form the first public high school in the country, which later becomes known as the City College of New York. The wooden schoolhouse, which housed this first school, was opened in 1787. Later, wings were added, the structure was renovated, and it was enlarged. By 1788, New York State had debated and ratified the new Constitution to replace the previous Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. In 1790, the small populations of Brooklyn and Brooklyn Heights are recorded for the first time in the United States Census of 1790. By 1797, the population of Brooklyn is recorded as 1,603 people. By 1801, construction begins on the Brooklyn Navy Yard along the East River. This is undertaken by the United States Department of the Navy. The Navy Yard was repeatedly enlarged over the next 150 years. Brooklyn is incorporated in 1816 with a population of 4,500. The Brooklyn Navy Yard is home to massive shipbuilding projects by the 1820s, including the Ohio, which launches to suppress slave trade in Africa. On the contrary, the Brooklyn Eagle, which supported the Democrats, becomes the most circulated newspaper in the entire United States around this time period. Many of the photographs in today's video come directly from the Brooklyn Eagle archives of the Brooklyn Historical Society. In 1823, Fort Brooklyn, the massive fort which shaped the city, is destroyed to make way for neighborhoods. Convenient for the history tellers, to say the least. By 1829, the Coney Island House opens, one of the first of many established meeting places for public retreat on the infamous Coney Island. In 1833, the Naval Lyceum is founded, a precursor to the main U.S. Navy Academy, which now resides in Maryland. Commodore Perry oversaw the Naval Academy. In 1834, Brooklyn is officially recognized as a city with a population now exceeding 23,000 people. The USS Fulton, the Navy's first steam-powered warship, is launched from the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1837. In 1838, the Greenwood Cemetery opens. Also in 1838, James Weeks, a freedman from Virginia, buys a large sect of land in Brooklyn, now known as Weeksville, which became the largest town of freedmen in the entire country before the Civil War. By 1840, Greek Revival architecture became abundant around Brooklyn, including the John Rankin House. In 1841, Fort Greene and its abundant fortifications are stripped away to make a park and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Again, just like the earlier indigenous earthworks, we have massive fortifications being torn down, covered over, all around Brooklyn. Some are destroyed to create these parks, while others are forts that are replaced by Greek Revival architecture. Do you see the pattern here? In 1843, the Brooklyn Institute is formed. In 1845, the Brooklyn Female Academy opens its doors. In 1847, the State Street Houses, a set of 23 row houses, essentially looking like ancient factories, are opened in Brooklyn. Also in 1847, we have a number of churches which are established throughout Brooklyn, including the Church of the Holy Trinity and the Central Presbyterian Church. In 1848, the Hawkins Circulating Library opens, and to match this advanced achievement, we have a multitude of additional cemeteries also opening in Brooklyn in the late 1840s. By the 1850s and the arrival of photography to Brooklyn, we have libraries opening in the area. Do you see how many of these creations, at least according to the currently accepted timeline, appear to happen in spurts, as in 1 year's time, we have a bunch of churches that open. Then the next year, it's a bunch of libraries. Then the next year, trolleys, etc., so on and so forth. I understand that technology here warrants this creation, but usually not in such a patterned capacity. But I digress. In 1850, the Brooklyn Law Library opens. In 1852, the Brooklyn Reading Room opens, another library. By 1869, the Mercantile Library is also opened, which amalgamates with the other libraries of Brooklyn to form the Brooklyn Public Library System. The Brooklyn YMCA opens in 1863 to house and occupy the abundance of young men in the city. At the same time, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn is established. Orphans run rampant in the streets. In 1854, one of the first organized baseball teams, the Brooklyn Excelsiors, is established in the city. And by 1855, the city is expanded to include the adjacent neighborhoods and small towns of Bushwick, Greenpoint, and Williamsburg. In 1856, the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute opens, becoming the premier technical school in all of the country. In 1857, the Philharmonic Society is formed in Brooklyn. Naval Barbary Surgeon E.R. Squibb engineers one of the first pharmaceutical companies in Brooklyn in 1857, which provides the majority of all medical supplies for the Union Army during the Civil War. A large reservoir, known as Ridgewood, is completed in Brooklyn by 1858. The Brooklyn area was also heavily involved in the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable, a cable across the ocean floor to allow direct and nearly instant communication across the sea. This was done the whole way back in 1858 when Brooklyn's USS Niagara met with the British HMS Agamemnon in the middle of the sea to connect the first cable. The experiment was a success, however, the cable soon deteriorated and broke. In 1859, baseball was again pioneered in Kings County when Larry Corcoran became the first to use signals to his players during the game. By 1860, the population of Brooklyn exceeded 266,000 people, or over 250,000 people, basically all within the limits of Long Island and small portions of neighborhoods on the mainland. This is when Kings County really began to flourish, and this is around the same time that a majority of these photographs were taken. The massive Kings County Savings Bank is built in 1860, the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1861, as well as the Courthouse and Park Theater in 1862. Also in 1862, the railway began carrying passengers from Coney Island to Brooklyn. The Cypress Hills National Cemetery, the only national cemetery in New York City, was opened in Brooklyn in 1862. The sprawling Continental Iron Works opened in Brooklyn in 1863, supplying the Union Army with massive ironclads. Also in 1863, the Brooklyn Historical Society opens, taking the reins of the narrative, consequently also being the source of many of today's photographs. In 1864, the Brooklyn Sanitary Fair begins operation, said to be a fair dedicated to sanitation, but indeed seems to be a fair about reintroduction or introducing a new set of beliefs to a new cast of people. The Surf House is established on Coney Island by 1865, and by the end of the Civil War, again, we have massive renovations that are conducted on the city of Brooklyn, essentially wiping out any remains of the indigenous creation to form a European-centric viewpoint for the history of Brooklyn. It reaches its apex in 1869 when Francis Law Olmsted creates Prospect Park, a 585-acre park on previous earthworks said to be unoccupied land. In 1869, the Brooklyn Fire Department is established, and more canals are meticulously built, including Gowanus. The Adelphi and St. John's colleges are also opened by that same year. By 1870, the population of Brooklyn is nearly 400,000 people. The Brooklyn Ocean Parkway, an extensive 5-mile road, opens, traversing the city. In 1874, the Flatbush Town Hall. In 1875, the Williamsburg Savings Bank. And in 1878, the Brighton Beach experiences rapid growth, all due to the opening of the Brighton Beach Railway Line and Hotel. In 1879, the Brighton Beach Race Course opens, one of the first race courses in all of New York. In 1883, the absolutely astonishing Brooklyn Bridge opens, a miraculous construction, seemingly well ahead of its time, spanning the East River from Manhattan Island to Brooklyn Heights. Continuing in this miraculous construction, by 1885 we have the Brooklyn Elevated Railroad that begins its operation. By 1890, the population of Brooklyn has exceeded 838,000 people, making Brooklyn the 4th largest city in all of America. By 1892, the Soldiers and Sailors Arch Monument is completed, and in 1896, the Library System of Brooklyn goes public. Also in 1896, it's written Brooklyn had reached its capacity for growth as all the available territory within the Kings County boundary line had been urbanized. However, on January 1st, 1898, Brooklyn is recognized as one of the official 5 boroughs of the city of Greater New York, along with Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Queens. Interestingly, this is the time when most believed that Kings County, or Brooklyn, had reached its apex. However, the city was then expanded again with a new municipal charter after a long debate amongst its residents. In 1899, Al Capone was born in Brooklyn, and by the year 1900, the population of just the borough of Brooklyn had exceeded 1,160,000 people. This population then continues to grow throughout the mid to late 1900s, with Brooklyn and Coney Island in particular being the destination for many Americans seeking out leisure, especially those along the East Coast. Coney Island was home to multiple Luna parks. Each was a different establishment with the same name. These parks housed massive roller coasters, but they also housed Antiquitech achievements in electricity, the unseen, and the unknown, including multiple early freak shows. The entirety of Coney Island was said to be comprised mostly of these amusement parks. So we have to wonder how many parts of New York City, including the Kings Road, all of the roads really that interconnected Brooklyn with the rest of New York, as well as the earthworks, the mounds, the very foundation of Brooklyn. How much of that could have really been created by the Lenape?